the day my mother told me to get out. I was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. I remember that detail because I'd been standing in the hallway outside her office for nearly half an hour, waiting for her assistant to wave me in. The coffee was still hot when I got there. It was not hot anymore by the time she looked up at me. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. My mother had always been efficient with cruelty. She didn't waste words on it the way some people do. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and told me to read it before she explained anything. I set the cold cup down on the edge of her mahogany desk and picked up the page. It was a letter of separation. My name at the top, her signature at the bottom, and in the middle, 3 paragraphs explaining that my position at Whitfield and Associates, the property management company my grandfather had built from nothing, the company my mother had inherited and expanded, and, in my understanding, the company I had worked at since I was 22, was being terminated, effective immediately. The letter cited redundancy and restructuring. The letter was dated 3 days ago. I looked up at her. She was already looking at me. "Your brother needs room to grow," she said. "You've never really fit here, and I think part of you knows that." My brother, 14 months younger than me, who had been hired 18 months ago after 2 failed ventures and a stint at a marketing consultancy in Montreal that ended quietly and badly, who had, in the time since, been given a corner office, a title I'd been told wasn't available, and an expense account that I had once been told wasn't in the budget. I asked her if this was because of what I'd said in the meeting last Thursday. She didn't answer. I asked her again. She told me that this wasn't a negotiation, and that security could walk me out if I preferred not to leave on my own. I left on my own. I sat in my car in the parkade for a while. It was February, one of those gray Halifax days where the sky goes flat and colorless, and the wind comes off the water and finds the gaps in everything. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because this is not a story about a man who falls apart. I sat in my car, engine running for the heat, and I thought about the last 6 years I had given to that company. The weekends I had worked, the clients I had brought in, the reports I had written that went up the chain with my mother's name on them. And then I thought about my grandfather. His name was Hugh Whitfield. He had built the company in the 1970s out of a single rental property in Dartmouth, and a stubbornness that his family called a character flaw, and the rest of the world eventually called a business model. He had died 18 months before I was let go. 81 years old, still sharp, still working 2 mornings a week from his study at home. He had left the company to my mother with conditions, and the house on the eastern shore to her as well, and to me he had left a single thing: the key to his fishing cabin on Jeddore Lake, about an hour east of the city. My mother had told me at the reading that the cabin was barely standing, that Grandpa Hugh had let it go in his last few years when his knees couldn't manage the terrain, and that it was probably worth pulling down rather than trying to save. She had said this in the tone she used when she was trying to make something sound like your idea. I had taken the key anyway, put it in my jacket pocket and driven home. That key had been sitting in a drawer in my apartment for 18 months. I went home that afternoon, pulled it out, and held it in my hand for a long time. I had a little under $400 in my checking account. My savings were not dramatic. I had been paying off student loans and living in an apartment in the North End that was fine but not cheap, and I had been counting on the job the way you count on something you believe is permanent. The severance they've offered me was minimal. The letter had been careful about that. 2 weeks. I had not signed anything yet, which I noted as the one thing that had gone in my favor. I drove out to Jeddore Lake the next morning. My mother had not been wrong about the state of it. The cabin sat back from the water on a slope of old spruce and birch, and it was clear that several winters had worked on it without interference. The roof had gone soft in sections. One of the porch steps had rotted through entirely. The windows on the lake-facing side had been boarded at some point, and the boards had warped and pulled away at the corners. The wood siding had gone from the color I remembered, a dark cedar stain that Grandpa Hugh refinished every few years, to something between gray and green, the color of a thing surrendering to the weather. I stood in the driveway for a while and looked at it. A Stellar's jay landed on the porch railing and looked back at me. Then I went inside. It smelled like him. That was the first thing. Old wood and motor oil, and something faintly like the pipe tobacco he had stopped smoking years ago, but that had seeped into every surface regardless. The furniture was still there. The heavy spruce table, the two armchairs by the wood stove, the shelving he had built himself along the north wall, still holding his paperbacks and field guides and the marine charts he used to spread out on the table when he was planning nothing in particular but liked to look at them anyway. The kitchen was small and dark. The bathroom was functional but grim. The master bedroom was at the back of the cabin, overlooking the lake through a single window that he had always kept unboarded, because he said the first thing he wanted to see in the morning was the water. I sat on the edge of his bed. The mattress was still there, still decent, covered in an old Hudson's Bay wool blanket, and I looked out at the lake. It was iced over still in February. The surface was dull white under the flat sky. I made a decision there. It was not dramatic. I did not speak it out loud or make a list. I just decided. I would fix the cabin. I would stay here while I did it. I would figure out the rest afterward. The next several months were the hardest physical work I have ever done in my life, and I say that as someone who is not afraid of hard work. I had grown up watching my grandfather use his hands, and I had done enough around his place over the years to know the basics. How to swing a hammer without hurting myself. How to read a level. How to pull a nail cleanly so the wood doesn't split. But there is a difference between knowing the basics and gutting and rebuilding a cabin that has been neglected for 3 Nova Scotia winters. I used the library in Sheet Harbor for internet when I needed it, and the woman at the desk there, I think her name was Doreen or something close, stopped asking me what I was researching and just waved me to the same corner table every time I came in. I watched videos on sister joists and vapor barriers and subfloor replacement. I read a guide on chimney repointing from a Government of Nova Scotia forestry document I found through some link I can't remember anymore. I made mistakes and fixed them. I made worse mistakes and fixed those too. The money was a constant problem. I stretched the severance across materials I bought carefully, prioritized by what would cause structural damage if left unaddressed. The roof first because water is the thing that destroys everything else. Then the floor in the back bedroom, which had gone spongy in one corner where water had been getting in through a gap below the window frame. Then the porch, then the windows. I sold my car in April and bought my grandfather's old truck from my aunt, his sister, who had always been quietly on my side about most things and asked no questions, for $2,000. The truck was a 1987 Silverado with a tailgate that needed persuading and a heater that worked in a loose, aspirational kind of way. It became the most useful thing I owned. I was in the cabin full-time by March. I ate simply. I did not feel sorry for myself. Or at least I tried not to, though there were nights when the wind was bad and the wood stove was temperamental, and I thought about my brother sitting in his corner office with his expense account, and the anger would come up hot and sudden, and I would have to take it somewhere, outside into the cold, usually, or into the work, most of the time, into the work. It was July when I found the wall. I had been working on the master bedroom, my grandfather's room, replacing the baseboard along the interior north wall where moisture had gotten behind it. I had pulled the baseboard away cleanly and was checking the bottom plate when I knocked my fist against the wall itself, the way you do sometimes without thinking, just checking. And the sound was wrong. I knocked again, and then again, slowly, moving along the wall. There was a section, about 4 feet wide, starting roughly 2 feet from the corner, where the knock went from solid to hollow. Not hollow like a gap, but hollow like a cavity, a deliberate cavity. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. My grandfather was not a dramatic man. He was not given to secrets or gestures. He had been practical in almost every way that a person can be practical. So the question wasn't whether there was something behind that wall. The question that sat in my chest like a stone while I stared at the wallboard was why a man like him would build a false wall in the first place. I got the crowbar. It took a while. I was trying to be careful, which slowed me down. I removed the drywall in pieces rather than swinging at it, because whatever was behind it I didn't want to damage. The cavity behind the wall was about 4 feet wide and 8 inches deep, running from close to the floor to just above shoulder height. It had been framed properly. My grandfather had done it right, the way he did everything, with a sheet of rigid insulation behind it and vapor barrier sealed at the edges. On the ledge at the bottom of the cavity, there was a metal box, one of those old gray lock boxes you used to see in offices, with a lever handle and a cylinder lock, and beside it, a smaller wooden box, handmade, with a fitted lid, the kind he used to make in the shop when he was building something for no practical reason, except that he felt like it. The wooden box was not locked. Inside it was a note in his handwriting. Careful, small, slanting slightly to the right the way it always did, and a key. The key was small and flat, the kind that opens a lockbox. The note said, "You'll find this because you look at things properly. That's always been the difference. The rest is in the box. Use it carefully and don't let them make you feel like you have to rush." That was all. No explanation. No list of instructions. Just that. And the key. I sat down on the floor of his bedroom with the note in my hand, and I did not cry, which I had also not cried when my mother told me to leave, but I came closer to it there on the floor of that cabin than I had in a long time, because the note sounded like him. Exactly like him. The way he talked when he was being direct. No warmth performed for performance's sake, just the thing itself. The lockbox opened on the first try. Inside there were documents, legal-sized envelopes, several of them, bound with a wide elastic that had gone brittle and snapped when I touched it. There were also certificates. Paper, older, the kind printed on heavyweight stock with engraved borders. Bearer bonds. Canadian government savings bonds, issued in the 1960s and 1970s, some of them. And 3 certificates from a mining company registered in New Brunswick that I did not recognize at first. I counted what I could. The face value of the savings bonds alone came to $140,000. The mining certificates, I would need to look into those, and I did over the following weeks, with a lawyer in Dartmouth named Mr. Pelham, who had done my grandfather's estate work, turned out to be worth considerably more. The mining company had been absorbed into a larger corporation in 1988, and the shares had split and split again, and what my grandfather had put away quietly in the 1970s had, by the time I found it, a redeemable value of approximately $800,000. Total. Combined. Just over $940,000, sitting behind a false wall in a fishing cabin on Jeddore Lake. I drove into the city the following week and met with Mr. Pelham. He was a small, careful man who wore bow ties and read everything twice before he spoke. He looked at the documents for a long time. He asked me where I had found them. I told him. He asked if anyone else knew about them. I said not yet. He set the papers down carefully and looked at me over his glasses. These were not included in the estate inventory. He said, "No," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you know why?" I thought about that. I had been thinking about it since the floor of the bedroom. "I think he knew who would find them," I said, "and he wanted it to be whoever fixed the cabin." Mr. Pelham looked at me for another moment, and then nodded slowly, as if that was a satisfactory answer. The legal process was not fast, but it was not complicated. The assets had been my grandfather's, held outside the estate in a way that was fully legal. He had consulted with a lawyer about it, Mr. Pelham confirmed, a different lawyer, years ago, and it had all been structured correctly. The cabin itself had been left to me directly. The contents of the cabin, as the deed and will both specified, belonged to the property, to me. My mother found out in September. I did not tell her. Mr. Pelham sent a letter, formal, careful, laying out the situation, and she called me after she received it. I let it ring and then called back an hour later. She was not yelling when she answered. That was almost worse. Her voice had gone very quiet and very controlled. "There's no reason this needed to go through lawyers," she said. "I think there was," I said. If you had just talked to me. You had me walked out of the building with my box of things while my brother watched from his office doorway, I said. I didn't feel like talking after that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would not have wanted this to become adversarial." And I thought about the note in his handwriting, sitting now in the top drawer of the desk in the cabin. "You'll find this because you look at things properly." I thought about what that meant, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation. He had known his daughter, he had known my brother, and he had built a wall. "I think Grandpa Hugh wanted exactly this," I said. "I think he wanted someone to do the work, and I think he wanted that person to have what they found." She did not have a response to that. Eventually she said she'd be in touch and hung up. She was. Her lawyers called Mr. Pelham. There were several conversations over several weeks. In the end, there was nothing to dispute. The will was clear. The deed was clear. The assets had been properly segregated decades before any of this happened, and the only reason they had not been disclosed during the estate process was that no one had thought to look behind the wall in the back bedroom of a cabin they had already decided wasn't worth saving. I finished the cabin by October. The roof held. The floors were solid. The windows let in the late autumn light in the afternoon and turned the whole interior a particular shade of amber that I had not seen in a room before and couldn't quite describe. I had rebuilt the porch with proper footings and replaced the railing with cedar that I stained to match what I remembered of the original color. The dock needed work too, and I did that in September before the weather closed in. New decking, new hardware, a fresh coat of marine paint on the frame. There is a photograph I took on the first morning after I finished the last of it, standing on the dock in the early gray of an October dawn with the lake still and dark in front of me and the cabin behind me with the lights on inside. I took it on my phone. The image is nothing spectacular, but I look at it sometimes and I remember what it felt like to have finished a thing. My brother called me once, that autumn. I don't know what he was expecting from the conversation. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. I told him I didn't have hard feelings, which was mostly true by then. I had spent months with my hands in the work of something that needed fixing, and there is something in that. Something I didn't have a word for then and still struggle to name, that takes the edge off the anger. Not all of it, not permanently. But enough. I told him he could come out to the lake sometime. He said maybe he would. He hasn't. I started a small property management consultancy out of Dartmouth the following spring. Deliberately small. 1 office, 2 employees. I used some of what I had found to start it, and the rest went into a trust I set up with Mr. Pelham's help, an education fund for a few of the kids in the extended family, including, yes, my brother's daughter who is 6 years old and has nothing to do with any of this. My grandfather's company, my mother's company now, is still running. I hear about it occasionally. It is doing fine, as far as I know. My brother is still there. My mother is still at the head of the table. I am not. The cabin is not a rental. I am not interested in monetizing it. I go out there on weekends when the work allows, and I sit in the armchair by the wood stove that was his armchair. And I look at the shelves he built with the books still on them. I haven't moved a single one. And I think about the kind of man who spends a day building a false wall in a fishing cabin with careful framing and proper vapor barrier and rigid insulation, and who leaves behind a note that doesn't explain itself because he trusted that the right person would understand it without explanation. I am 31 now. I run a small business. I own a cabin. I drive the old Silverado, which I finally got the heater working on properly last winter, after watching an embarrassing number of hours of videos about 1987 GM HVAC systems. My grandfather was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He did not say "I love you" easily or often, but he built things to last, and he thought carefully about who he was building them for, and sometimes I think that is the thing we forget to count as love. The long, quiet, structural kind. The kind you only find when you're willing to do the work.